The semester had finally ended, and 9 students from Ibadan Academy were filled with excitement. Christmas was around the corner, and after months of studying, they were finally heading home to their families. The group had pulled their money together and hired a small bus to take them back to their hometowns. Inside the bus, laughter and chatter filled the air. Zai, the quick-witted and observant girl, talked about all the food she was going to eat. Adisa, always the joker, made everyone laugh with his dramatic impersonations of their strict teachers. Kweku and Tariq were debating over which gifts they should get their younger siblings. Ayo, the quiet one, simply gazed out of the window, enjoying the peaceful scenery. The road stretched out like a golden ribbon under the afternoon sun. Tall trees lined both sides, their leaves swaying gently, as if waving goodbye. Everything about the day felt perfect. Their driver, Baba Kofi, was an old man with years of experience on the road. His face was carved with deep lines, like a map of the many journeys he had taken. But today, his eyes held a strange look. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel and muttered, "This road, something doesn't feel right today." The students barely paid attention. They were lost in their excitement. Suddenly, the bus slowed down. "What's happening?" asked Zay, her voice sharp with concern. Baba Kofi squinted ahead. "Look there." By the side of the road stood an old woman. She wore a faded wrapper, her grey hair tied back in a loose knot. She was waving frantically beside a broken-down van. One of the tires lay flat, and smoke curled weakly from the hood. "Help me. Please, help me," she cried, her voice cracking like dry wood. Some of the students leaned out of the windows, their hearts softening. "We have to stop," Adisa said firmly. Baba Kofi shook his head. "No. This road is dangerous. We should keep moving." "But Baba," Tariq protested, "she looks so helpless. What if she's someone's grandmother?" The others nodded in agreement. "Have you never heard of traps?" Baba Kofi muttered. "This doesn't feel right." But their kind hearts won over their caution. The students pleaded with him to stop. Reluctantly, Baba Kofi sighed and pulled the bus over. The students stepped out, their faces bright with kindness. "Mama, don't worry," Zay said, stepping forward. "We'll help you." The old woman lifted her head and smiled. Something about that smile sent a shiver down Baba Kofi's spine. Before anyone could react, the old woman let out a loud, piercing whistle. The sound cut through the air like a blade. Suddenly, figures emerged from the trees, men, masked and armed. The students barely had time to scream before the men surrounded them, guns pointed at their chest. "Down! Now," one of the men shouted. Terror rushed through their veins like ice. They had walked straight into a trap. The students barely had time to react before rough hands shoved them to the ground. Their hearts pounded like the sound of war drums, fear gripping them tighter than any chain. "Tie their hands," one of the masked men barked. The kidnappers moved quickly, yanking the students' arms behind their backs and tying them with rough, thick ropes. Zay winced as the rope cut into her skin. The smell of dust and sweat filled the air as they were forced down onto their knees. Baba Kofi, still behind the wheel of the bus, tried to start the engine, but before he could, a gunshot cracked through the air. "Don't try it, old man," one of the kidnappers growled, pointing a gun at his chest. "Or you die right here." The old man raised his trembling hands, knowing resistance was useless. The students could barely process what was happening. Just a few minutes ago, they had been laughing, dreaming about Christmas. Now, they were at the mercy of these masked men. Please, let us go," Kweku stammered, his voice shaking. "We don't have any money. We are just students." One of the kidnappers, a tall man with a scar running down his arm, laughed coldly. "You don't need money," he sneered. Your families have it. And if they don't, well, he shrugged. The students felt a chill run down their spines. The old woman, the one they had thought needed help, was now standing with the kidnappers, her arms crossed. Her face had changed, her helpless act now gone. She had set them up. Move them, Scaram commanded. The kidnappers yanked the students to their feet, their hands still tightly bound. Where are you taking us? Adisa demanded, his voice filled with fear. One of the men slammed the butt of his rifle into Adisa's back. Shut up and walk. The students stumbled forward, pushed toward the trees. The once beautiful, peaceful forest now looked like a dark mouth ready to swallow them whole. The bus engine roared to life. Zeri turned her head just in time to see one of the kidnappers driving it away. The bus, their only way home, was gone. They had nowhere to run. A long, terrifying march. The kidnappers forced them deeper into the forest, their rough hands shoving them forward. The ground was uneven, roots grabbing at their feet like unseen hands. The blindfolds made it worse. They couldn't see where they were going. Only the sounds guided them, the hooting of owls, the rustling of leaves, the whispers of the wind. The deeper they walked, the colder the air became. Adisa tripped over a hidden root, falling hard. Please, I can't walk anymore, he gasped, his body trembling. A sharp kick landed on his side. Move, or I'll leave you here for the wild animals, a kidnapper growled. The others helped Adisa to his feet. There was no choice but to continue. Finally, they reached a clearing deep in the forest. A small, abandoned hut sat in the middle, surrounded by thick trees. A dying fire flickered nearby, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Get down, Scaram ordered. The students were forced to kneel. One by one, their blindfolds were removed. For the first time, they saw their captors clearly. There were 5 men in total. Scaram, the leader, had a voice sharp like a blade. A bald man with a missing tooth chewed on a piece of wood like he had all the time in the world. A short, muscular man cleaned his gun, his eyes scanning the students like he was picking his next meal. A tall, thin man, the quietest of the group, simply leaned against a tree, watching. And the last man, the one who had kicked Adisa, stood near the fire, his eyes cold and dead. Their faces were hidden behind masks, but their eyes held no mercy. Now listen. Scaram's voice rang through the night. Call your families. Tell them to send money. If they don't, you won't see the sunrise. The students exchanged terrified glances. Their hands shook as the kidnappers shoved phones into their faces. Zeri swallowed hard. How could this be happening? One by one, they dialed their families. Their voices were full of fear and desperation. Mama, please, they have me, Ao whispered into the phone, his voice breaking. They want money, if you don't send it, they'll. The words choked him. The phone was snatched from his hands. Ao's mother's voice screamed through the speaker, pleading to know where her son was. The kidnappers ended the call. Another student was forced to speak. Papa, please. Please send the money. Zeri's voice trembled as tears ran down her face. Her father's panicked voice barely got a chance to respond before the kidnappers cut the call. One by one, each student called home, begging for their lives. For some, their parents promised to pay. But for others, there was silence. Not every family had money. Some could not afford to save their child. Scaram's cold laughter echoed in the night. The rest of you, better pray, he said, his voice chilling. Because if no money comes by morning, one of you will die. The fire crackled. The night grew darker. And hope slipped further away. The night felt heavier than usual, as if the darkness itself was pressing down on them. The fire in the middle of the clearing crackled weakly, casting eerie shadows across the terrified faces of the students. They sat huddled together, their hands still tied, their hearts racing. Across from them, Scarham paced back and forth, his boots crunching against the dry leaves. He stopped suddenly and turned to them, his sharp eyes gleaming in the dim light. "By sunrise," he said, his voice cold and sharp, "if your families don't send the money, one of you will die." The students shivered. Zeri clenched her jaw, trying to steady her breathing. Her father had promised to send money, but would it arrive in time? What about the others? Would all of them be saved? Adisa, who always had a joke to lighten the mood, remained silent. He stared at the ground, his lips pressed into a thin line. For once, there was nothing funny to say. Eo sat next to him, whispering prayers under his breath, rocking back and forth. Kweku kept glancing at the kidnappers, his mind racing, searching for a way out. The fear was suffocating. A night of desperation. One of the kidnappers, the bald man with a missing tooth, smacked and tossed an old mobile phone onto the ground. "Time for the next round of calls," he said. One by one, the students were forced to call their families again, pleading for their lives. "Papa, please, they'll kill me if you don't pay," Zay whispered, trying to keep her voice from breaking. "I don't have enough, my child," her father cried on the other end. "I have gathered some, but it is not the full amount." Zay's stomach twisted. The kidnapper grabbed the phone from her hand. "Tell your father if he doesn't pay everything by morning, he'll get his daughter back in pieces," the kidnapper said before hanging up. Zay felt sick. Her father was trying, but trying wasn't enough. The same happened with the others. Some parents begged for more time. Some wept uncontrollably, helpless and desperate. And some, like Eo's family, never even picked up the phone. Eo's body trembled as he sat in silence. "They didn't answer," he whispered. The kidnappers laughed cruelly. "Looks like we already know who the first one to go is," Scar muttered, walking past Eo, tapping the butt of his rifle against his palm. Eo closed his eyes, his shoulders shaking. Zay wanted to scream. She wanted to fight back, to do something. But they were tired. Helpless. Outnumbered. Hope and hopelessness. As the hours passed, the kidnappers grew bored. Some sat around the fire, drinking from small bottles and talking in hushed tones. Others sharpened their knives or cleaned their guns, their eyes occasionally drifting toward their captives. The students huddled closer, whispering amongst themselves. "There has to be a way out," Kweku said, his voice urgent. "There is no way out," Adisa replied bitterly. "We are surrounded by armed men in the middle of the forest." Zay's mind raced. No one was watching them closely. The men were relaxed. Complacent. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance. A deadly warning. Near midnight, Scarham stood and stretched. He turned to his men. One last warning shot should make the families hurry up. He grabbed his rifle and aimed at a tree, firing into the night. The loud bang echoed through the forest. The students flinched, some letting out small cries. Scarham smiled cruelly. "Next time, I'll aim lower." He walked away, leaving them alone in the dark, their minds filled with terror. The night stretched on endlessly, and the students could do nothing but wait. Wait and pray. The night dragged on, stretching endlessly like a nightmare that refused to end. The students sat in silence, their bodies aching from being tied up for so long. Every sound in the forest, the hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves, the distant howl of an animal, made them flinch. Some had been able to get their families to send money. But for others, there was no answer. Leo sat frozen, his face pale. His parents had never picked up the phone. Tariq, whose father had promised to send the money, kept checking the shadows where the kidnappers sat, hoping they would confirm the payment soon. Zoe clenched her jaw, trying to stay calm. But the weight of what was about to happen sat heavily on her chest. Then, just before dawn, Scarham stood up. "All right," he said, stretching his arms. "Let's see who stays and who dies." The decision. The kidnappers gathered in front of the students. Scarham's gaze swept over them, like a butcher choosing which animal to slaughter. He pulled out a phone and began checking the ransom payments. He muttered, scrolling through the list. Then he looked up, his eyes sharp like a blade. "Eo." Eo froze. "Your family hasn't paid." Scarham smiled coldly. "That means you're first." The students gasped. "No. Please, wait," Zoe started, but Scarham raised his gun. Eo's body trembled violently. His lips quivered, but no words came out. "Please," he finally whispered. Scarham ignored him. He grabbed Eo by the collar and yanked him up. "No. Leave him alone." Adisa screamed. Eo kicked and struggled, but Scarham was too strong. He dragged him toward the trees, away from the others. Eo's eyes locked onto Zoe's. She could see it, the sheer, paralyzing terror in his gaze. And then, bang! A gunshot ripped through the silence. The student screamed. Eo's body collapsed into the dirt. Zoe felt her stomach twist. Tears blurred her vision. She wanted to run to him, to help him, but she couldn't move. Adisa turned away, his whole body shaking. Kweku clenched his fist so hard his nails dug into his skin. Scarham walked back, wiping the barrel of his gun. He pointed at the rest of them. "If no more money comes by tomorrow, another one of you dies." Then he sat back down, as if he hadn't just ended a life. The forest grew silent again. But this time, it wasn't just fear in the students' hearts. It was rage. And desperation. They had to find a way out. The students sat in shock, their bodies frozen in place. The gunshot still echoed in their minds, ringing louder than anything they had ever heard. Eo was gone. His lifeless body lay somewhere in the darkness of the forest, left to the wild. Zoe swallowed hard, fighting back tears. The kidnappers didn't care about their pain. They didn't care that they had just taken someone's life. To them, Eo was just a warning. And if they didn't find a way out, one of them would be next. The whispered plan. The kidnappers sat around the fire, eating from a pot of steaming soup. They weren't paying attention anymore. Scarham counted stacks of cash in his lap. Some ransoms had been paid. Others were still missing. Zoe took a slow breath and leaned toward Adisa. "We have to get out of here," she whispered. Adisa nodded but looked hesitant. "How? They have guns." Kweku leaned in, his voice barely audible. "They are getting careless. They think we're too scared to run." Zoe's eyes darted toward the ropes binding their wrists. They were tight, but not impossible to untie. "If we can get loose," she whispered, "we can escape when they fall asleep." The three of them exchanged looks. It was risky. But it was their only chance. A dangerous distraction. That night, the kidnappers grew louder, arguing amongst themselves. One of them, the bald man with the missing tooth, shouted at Scarham. "We should be getting more. We are doing the hard work while you sit here counting money." Scarham's eyes darkened. "Do you want to take my place?" The bald man stood up angrily. "Maybe I should." The other kidnappers tensed. Their hands moved toward their guns. Zoe's heart pounded. This was it. The distraction they needed. Slowly, she began twisting her hands against the rope. Adisa did the same, his breath shaky as he loosened the knots. Kweku's fingers moved carefully, pulling at the edges. The kidnappers continued to argue, their voices rising. Then, a shove. Scaram pushed the bald man hard, nearly knocking him into the fire. The other kidnappers jumped up. They weren't paying attention. Zay felt the rope slip. She was free. She quickly moved to help Adisa, then Kweku. One by one, they loosened their bindings. The moment had come. They ran for freedom. Zay gave them a look. Now. They moved quickly, crawling away from the fire. The shadows of the forest swallowed them, hiding them in the darkness. But just as they broke into a run, a branch snapped. The kidnappers spun around. Hey! They are running. A gunshot shattered the night. The students sprinted into the forest. Branches slashed their arms and faces. Their feet pounded against the damp earth. Behind them, the kidnappers shouted, chasing after them. Run! Adisa gasped. Zoe's lungs burned, but she didn't stop. The sound of footsteps grew closer. More gunshots. Then, a scream. Zoe turned her head. One of the students had been caught. It was Tariq. Go, he shouted. Save yourselves. But Zoe hesitated. They couldn't just leave him. Then, another gunshot. And this time, Tariq's scream stopped. Zoe choked on a sob but kept running. Ahead, a faint light flickered. A village. Salvation. They pushed forward, hearts racing, legs aching. They had to make it. They had to survive. Zoe's legs burned as she ran, her breath coming in sharp, painful gasps. Behind her, the kidnappers roared in anger. Gunshots cracked through the night, echoing through the dense forest. Branches slashed at her arms and face, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Adisa was beside her, his face drenched in sweat. Kweku stumbled, almost falling, but Zoe grabbed his arm and pulled him forward. The light of the village flickered ahead, a beacon of hope in the darkness. We are almost there. Adisa panted. But the kidnappers were closing in. Their heavy footsteps pounded against the earth, their voices sharp and furious. Stop running. Scaram bellowed. Then, another gunshot. A scream. Zoe whipped around. Adisa had been hit. He crumpled to the ground, clutching his side. No! Zoe cried, reaching for him. Adisa's blood stained his hands, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Kweku grabbed her. Zoe, we have to go. We can't save him. Tears blurred Zoe's vision. Adisa looked up at her, his eyes filled with pain. Go, he whispered. Another gunshot ripped through the air. Zoe had no choice. She turned and ran. The village's light. The kidnappers were right behind them. Kweku stumbled, gasping. They are gaining on us. Zoe's chest ached, but she pushed forward. Then, suddenly, the forest opened up. They burst into the village, stumbling onto a dirt path. Lanterns hung from wooden poles, casting a golden glow over the small huts. A group of villagers stood nearby, their eyes widening in shock at the sight of two bleeding, terrified students. Zoe barely had the strength to raise her hand. Help, she gasped, before collapsing to the ground. The villagers fight back. The kidnappers charged into the village, their weapons raised. But they had made a mistake. The villagers were not afraid. They are kidnappers. Kweku cried out, his voice hoarse. A group of strong village men stepped forward, gripping machetes, spears, and clubs. Scaram skidded to a stop. The kidnappers realized too late that they were outnumbered. Get them, an old man roared. The villagers attacked. The kidnappers tried to fight back, but they were overpowered. Scaram swung his gun, but a villager knocked it out of his hands with a club. Zoe, barely conscious, watched the battle through blurry eyes. The kidnappers screamed as they were beaten down. One by one, they fell. Some tried to run, but the villagers caught them. The last thing Zai saw before everything went black was Karam's furious face as he was dragged away. Then, darkness. The morning after. When Zoe opened her eyes, she was lying on a soft mat inside a small hut. A cool cloth was pressed against her forehead. She turned her head and saw Kweku beside her, sitting up, his arm bandaged. She sat up quickly. Where? The kidnappers have been captured, Kweku said. His voice was rough, exhausted. The villagers saved us. Zoe swallowed hard. Adisa and Tariq were gone. Leo was gone. Tears welled in her eyes. They had escaped, but at a terrible cost. The door of the hut opened, and an old village woman stepped in. You are safe now, child, she said gently. Rest. Zoe nodded weakly. She had survived. But she would never forget. The morning sun rose slowly, painting the sky in warm shades of orange and gold. The village was peaceful, but inside Zoe's heart, there was a storm. She sat outside the hut, wrapped in a thin blanket, staring at the dirt ground. Her mind replayed everything, the gunshots, the screams, the terror. Beside her, Kweku sat silently, his injured arm resting on his lap. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. They had survived. But not all of them had. Eo. Tariq. Adisa. Their laughter would never be heard again. Justice arrives. The sound of heavy footsteps made Zoe look up. A group of police officers had arrived in the village. They were dressed in dark uniforms, their expression serious. One of the village men stepped forward. The children you're looking for are here, he said. And the kidnappers are in our hands. A small murmur went through the villagers. The officers nodded. Take us to them. A few minutes later, Zay and Kweku watched as the kidnappers, bruised, bloody, and defeated, were dragged into police trucks. Scarham was last. His cold, furious eyes met Zay's. But this time, she wasn't afraid. He had lost. And they had won. The long road home. By noon, a police van arrived to escort them back home. Zay sat by the window, watching the trees blur past. The forest, once a place of nightmares, now looked peaceful under the bright sun. It felt strange. Like it was a different place. Like it hadn't just swallowed the lives of her friends. She turned away, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. She wanted to feel relieved. She wanted to be happy. But how could she, knowing some of them would never make it home? Kweku placed a hand on her shoulder. They would be proud of us, he whispered. Zari closed her eyes. Maybe they would. The mother's tears. When they arrived in the city, Zoe's heart pounded in her chest. She barely had time to step out of the van before she was wrapped in a tight embrace. Her mother. Zoe sank into her arms, sobbing. Mama. I thought I'd never see you again, she whispered. Her mother cried harder, kissing her forehead over and over. God heard my prayers. You're alive. My child, you're alive. Kweku was reunited with his family as well. Tears, joy, relief. But in the corner of the street, not every parent was lucky. Tariq's mother sat on the curb, wailing, her hands clutching her chest. Adisa's father stood in silence, tears running down his face. Eo's older brother stared at the ground, his fist clenched. Zari swallowed the lump in her throat. They had been so close to all making it home. Lessons learned. Days passed. The news of the kidnapping spread, shocking the entire country. People talked about it on the radio, on TV, in the streets. The government promised stricter measures to prevent kidnappings. The police announced the kidnappers would face justice. But for Zari, no news could erase the memories. One evening, she sat with her mother, staring out at the darkening sky. "Mama," she whispered. "Not everyone who looks helpless can be trusted." Her mother nodded, pulling her close. "Kindness is good, my child," she said softly. "But it must be mixed with wisdom." Zari held on to those words. She would never forget. And she would never make the same mistake again.